Anne, welcome. We love your work, and can I start by asking you, in your practice you've done works on a wide range of themes, filming in Antarctica, taking pictures of your own daughter's mouth, but over the years you've returned again and again to bees, both as an artist and I get the impression also as an individual. Why bees?
Good question. Anyway, lovely to be here, lovely to talk with you and have an opportunity to talk about this work. So why bees? Well, I became a beekeeper, and I think as any beekeeper, anyone who becomes a beekeeper and becomes fascinated with bees will, I suppose, concur with that you become enraptured by them. You become fascinated by them. And as an artist, that always then says, well, how do I find a way to talk about some of the things that I'm seeing and learning, and this, so and the desire to make art or to explore something through photography and through the various processes that I use is always it always runs alongside learning about something at depth. So that fascination and love of bees and of beekeeping then creates some wonderful challenges, because actually, how do you photograph bees? How do you? What can I do? What kind of? So various. Yeah, I was fascinated with various aspects. You know, the first time my hive swarmed, I happened to be there, and out poured thousands of bees, and the air was thick with bees, and they settled in a pohutukawa tree 30 feet up. No way was I going to be able to retrieve them. But they were sitting in this large, beautiful kind of heart-shaped form, just kind of present on their way to somewhere else. And so I loved that experience of actually, you know, my hive swarming set me on a journey to think about swarming bees. How might I make photographs of swarms? Yeah.
A lot of your work examines our relationship with nature as a species. And you've talked, I believe, about the perils of anthropomorphizing our fellow creatures. Can you tell us about how, in your practice and approach to your work, you think about bees and bee colonies to avoid that pitfall?
Yes, I suppose as an artist, these are some of the questions that drive your interest. For instance, you know, we as a beekeeper, you become aware of the extraordinary complexity of systems, living systems, and the bee, a colony of bees, is a complex living system. But it's intricately connected to the world beyond in ways that are really, you know, as soon as you begin to watch and observe, it's beyond our comprehension. People have been observing bees for thousands of years, and we know quite a lot about bees, but there is something about this kind of relationship amongst the colony itself and to the wider world beyond that is, I'm in awe of it still. So we tend to view other species from the perspective of being the pinnacle species, so that we are, you know, we have consciousness. And I go, So the kind of questions that art engages with as well, I'm not so sure about that. You know, if this becomes a privileged state of humankind, what about bee consciousness? What about this marvelous possibility of a hive having consciousness, and as an entity of 70,000 beings? And those then become the kind of questions that art can wonder about, muse about, that science wouldn't even dare asking.
Thank you for that. At the core of a lot of your work is prolonged observation and attentive watching. Indeed, the title of your book, Conversātiō, links into this concept. Can you expand more on that concept and the kind of approaches it leads you to take?
Yes, it's a beautiful word. It's a Latin word, Conversātiō. It's the root word of what we know as conversation, which we often associate with speaking, talking, where actually its origins are in Benedict monasticism. And I actually happen to have had a residency, privilege to undertake a residency at a monastery in central France that had been decommissioned and established as a contemporary art and music centre. I had 3 months there, and during the time, the invitation was to create a work that might speak to contemporary audiences, certainly about bees in the natural world, but also reflect on the kind of the traditions, the long traditions of the place itself. Bees are part of monastic culture, so bees lived in the buildings. You know, I could hear bees, there were swarms happening. So part of my thoughtfulness around a project for this place really related then thinking about the traditions of, you know, of monasticism. And this notion of Conversātiō was, it has many, many meanings, but I picked up this, it's a quality of silent and attentive listening. And that is a kind of quality that I love to bring to my work, but also hope to inspire in audiences. And there's a little kind of to me, a little sense of, it's a bit of a paradox, you know, if it means attentive listening, it's really then the most important component of any conversation. So preceding speech is this state of attentive being. Now that is something to bring to looking at bees.
The work shows that approach really strongly, and I love the photographs of the decommissioned monastery where you project some of these images in the cloisters, and I believe it was, yes. You keep your own beehives, and I've done so for quite a long while. Can I ask, in what ways do bees reveal more about their and our existence, especially relating to what we've just been talking about, deep observation of what they're up to over a long period of time?
So, as a beekeeper, it's a slow process. You know, you want to keep bees, and initially you want the honey. But really you have to be able to. They're never yours. You have the privilege of them living alongside you, and to keep bees you need to understand them. So that requires a lot of attentive observation. One of the things that I found myself doing was really, it made me far more observant of where they were feeding, what was the pollen they were bringing in, what native plants were flowering. And a lot of our native plants have very, very small, almost invisible flowers. And at certain times of the year, you know, my kind of walking through my own garden, I would suddenly be startled by the sound of intense bee activity in a tree that was flowering that I could not see the flowers, but the bees were alerting me to the fact that there was something going on. So, you know, having bees in your garden has you attend to not only the bees themselves, but what they're doing in the environment, your garden and the world beneath, because they will be sourcing food within 2-3 kilometre radius.
I know you like to listen to the sounds of bees in your beehive. I was wondering, what can you actually tell about what's going on in the beehive by listening to the sounds of the colony?
Oh, one thing I like to do was to, you know, watching the bees come home late in the afternoon. There's a saying, or it's in sort of mythic bee culture, that the bees are carriers of the souls of the dead. And sitting watching bees flying home when the light's low, there's this moment when the light's low enough that they're catching the wings. So the bees are like these flashes of light coming and going. And there is this, I could understand why that kind of sight might have prompted this idea or the sense of them being carriers of human souls, or that flash of light. But so listening, I watched them at night, but I also dropped microphones inside the hive. And very, very good quality microphones. So I'd drop them in and I'd sit and listen to them. And yeah, you hear all sorts of, it's just a general kind of hum. There's the sound of a happy, contented hive. There's the sound of the entranceway. There's the sound of drones. There's, you know, you can start to distinguish it. After a little while, they don't like microphones. I think they will react. So you can also detect a change in the sound around the microphone. So you withdraw them. I put contact microphones in, so I could actually listen to bees kind of walking around on different kinds of surfaces. And yeah, I know the sound because I've listened. I also know quite acutely that the bees will communicate a lot through sound, and the sound of a hive without a queen is a very, it's a kind of sad, almost haunting hum. So, and I was splitting my hives one year, and I took the queen from one hive and put it into another, and that left the hive alongside it without its queen. And it was quite remarkable. Within a very, very short period of time, that sound of a queenless hive was there. So every single bee, 50,000 bees, 30,000 bees, were suddenly aware they didn't have a queen, and that would have been communicated through sound, through smell, through a whole range of. But that it sounds, it sounds like, it's a haunting sound, not a happy hum. So
that's fabulous. Leading on from what we've just been talking about, can you just briefly tell us about the various different ways bees communicate to each other?
Well, I'm speculating. I do know that smell is very important, that bees will know the smell of their beekeeper. There's long been these are things that you learn as a beekeeper. Never go heavily perfumed near your beehive because the bees will not like it. Well, I suppose if you were smelling of their favourite flowers. But anyway, they're very acutely sensitive to smell. So their sensitivities relate to things that science is investigating in extraordinary ways. So how they see, how they perceive, and how they communicate. I'm not a bee, but I know that their perceptual mechanisms are far more complex than we would imagine. And I love this idea that we pride ourselves on the number of neurons in our brain, as if that's giving us some kind of edge on other beings who might have only some million neurons instead of what we have. And yet, what is extraordinary is that that brain is such an acutely precision organism. So, I laugh. I go, the number of neurons has got nothing to do with superiority of functioning. In fact, we're probably inhibited by the massive grey rubbish in our heads. I didn't answer your question really. Around how do they?
I was thinking as well more about the thing about how the bee dance, where they communicate with certain flowers and pollination, things like that.
So it's kind of vibration, smell, touch, movement, and they've got. So you can talk about language. How do they? Their language is multivarious. I do know that flowers communicate to bees because at certain times of the day when they are kind of giving off their nectar and they want the bees that they will radiate ultraviolet light. So there is a whole world, a perceptual world, happening between flowers and plants and bees that we do not see. So there's a perceptual world beyond our understanding. But the bee dance is a phenomenal thing because it involves mathematics and very understanding and communicating the relationship of a flower or a nectar source to the sun. So scientists who've done this do it in terms of geometry. And the bee dance is actually communicating a kind of distance, the angle of position of something in relationship to the sun, and bees will be able to follow exactly a set of instruction communicated by this dance. It's either a circle or an 8, so they communicate distance by a whole range of mechanisms.
What do you think we can learn as a species from the way bee colonies interact with the world and nature?
Well, there's a kind of perfection and a sense of that bees they are consciously and unconsciously as beings connected in perfect ways to the world beyond them. For some reason we don't have that capacity. Something I found really amusing is that we've often looked to this kind of perfect social entity and tried to find kind of political systems or social systems that might match, much to our detriment, because we're genetically wired some so differently. But I think we can just admire and learn from the kind of the importance of this kind of connectedness to the world beyond. You know, our kind of rational sense of understanding of the world is to break it up into little pieces, understand that little component, and when we understand that at depth, we think we know more. In fact, we fail, I think, the world by the way that we tend to look and perceive it. So I think what we can learn from bees is this marvellous interconnected complexity. And I think if we see that we are the same and all those kind of as individuals. Rudolf Steiner made a most marvellously mad kind of story about how a colony of bees can be compared to a human being. And he saw this, 30,000 bees operating as a kind of perfect entity, and saw the kind of functioning of the human body in a similar way, so that the kind of the processes of blood kind of transmitting oxygen around our bodies is something that happens perfectly without our even noticing it. So that in our bodies we are functioning as perfectly as a colony of bees. What's problematic is how this organism then interacts with the world beyond.
Photography is, in a sense, all about time. And the photographic image captures the ghost of a moment, a fragment of memory. And in your work, you've actually imagined photographs taken from a point in future time. Can you talk to us about the representation of time in your work?
Yes. So my photographing bees, I'm also playing with a medium that I absolutely love. So it's really a journey looking at the world, but using the medium of photography, which is an endlessly expanding series of technologies for interpreting, they're observational technology. So vastly expanding all the time. What was your question? Oh, time. Okay.
It's about time,
So I often think that there are two primary kind of tools that a photographer has. Time is one of them, because actually a photograph can kind of disturb our sense of time, but it can also slow time and actually create, which I really love to see or find in a photograph, a state of reverie, where you stop and actually can rethink or reimagine your relationship to something a little differently. So time is a part, it's one of the primary tools. So you stop time, but you also expand an experience of a moment. So the sense of time or photography creating that opportunity for an expanded moment. I think that's a kind of Henry James idea or William James idea, that sense of the expanded moment. But also light and time combined become the kind of tools that you use. And they're both, one's a kind of an interior mode of experiencing the world, and light is your means of kind of translation of something you observe. Plus, there's no other medium that's actually dealing with the surface appearance of the world as photography does. So it enables you to enhance our experience of the physical world, the material world.
In your photogram pictures of bees, the bees' wings ones, you dispense with cameras altogether and effectively use your body as a camera by holding the film in your hand. And kind of linking in what you've just said, the resulting images are incredibly beautiful. Can you maybe just talk us briefly through the ideas behind this, and also about how you went about actually physically creating those images?
So, one of the things that about photography that I was thinking about as I was photographing bees is, and really wanting to make work that would have people raise people's sense of the importance of bees as an indicator species to what we are losing daily because of our lack of care of our environment. So we often think about, we can pay a lot of attention to a baby pilot whale, which will create a huge amount of emotion. The polar bear kind of sitting on the breaking, and yet, we are losing far more of our biodiversity at the invisible level. So, our use of chemicals on the environment, rampant growth of industrialised agriculture is destroying the environment for the world that we cannot see. So the microbiological world, and I often see the bee as it's the visible end of an invisible world that we risk losing. So something about photography has this, because it also kind of triggers memory. We have a relationship with photography that is there to remind us of something that has gone. So there's a way to play with photography that can be elegant. So you can forecast, and this was my idea really with some of this work, was to forecast the death of something or the loss of something by being very elegant. So with the photograms, I was in the United States actually, and working in Chicago. At that time, there had been a massive, there's some commercial beekeepers who had lost all of their hives because of pesticide drift across an area of land. So I contacted the beekeeper and said, put a colony in your freezer and I will come and collect it. So I got this colony of dead bees that had been poisoned and I put them in my freezer and then wondered what I was going to do with them. And this idea occurred that actually I could, if I collected the wings of all these dead bees, I might have something that I could work with. And I had no idea really what I was going to do, except that over many evenings, to the horror of my husband, the colony of dead bees, which was, it had a certain aroma, would be on our living room floor, and we would pluck the wings. And until I had a nice sort of little pile, thousands of bee wings. And that was a very meditative process. And they're so fine and they're so small and they're exquisitely beautiful. And the idea occurred to me that I could actually make photograms of these wings. So I invented a process. And that is something also that is it's a very playful way to be a photographer, is to know that basically we have light, we have time. We also have chemically sensitive media, sensitive to light and the passage and the transmission of light. So I took a roll of film and worked in the complete darkness, spread the bee wings along this piece of film, rolled it back up, and then held it in my hands like that. And had someone help me turn on the light. And we used a kind of daylight, kind of very slightly bluish light, which I then let pass through my hands. And the exposure was probably 5-6 minutes. So really letting the light, so I got this sort of ball of film and wings, And who knows what's going to happen? It's an experiment. So I'm imagining the outcome. And when I developed the film and I scanned the negatives, the results were really quite extraordinary because some strange things happened. When the light was actually passing through my fingers, but like if a child puts a torch in their mouth in a darkened room, the cheeks are red. So all the colour of my skin and flesh was also colouring these negatives. So I had light, the colour of skin, and the actual light transmitting through layers and layers and layers of bee wings. So it was a different kind of process than a photogram where you will put something sitting on a light-sensitive surface and you will capture the outline. This was a very kind of complex way to actually visualise something. So I did it more and more, yes. I played over a month with ways to use this process.
The final results are fabulous, by the way. You obviously like to embrace random chance, perhaps, in some of your creative process. And I was wondering, does that kind of approach have connections to natural processes you perhaps observe?
Well, I think what I've described is certainly by chance. So the outcome, the first photograms were very, very surprising. So you look at the results and you've imagined an outcome, and when something approximates what you've imagined, you can understand how chance is a component of an actual creative process and reuse it. So certainly in my processes I'm always alerted to the chance accident. The bee photograph behind us is, for me, it's an accidental capturing of the kind of wing beats. And that's, so I absolutely could, from that photograph, work out how to repeat that by. So, I didn't answer your question. But I can speak, you can cut this.
Yes, of course you can.
So, I love how chance operates in a creative way within projects. So a lot of the people that I met who have been really pivotal and inspirational in my project, I have met by chance. By setting out on a journey and being open to possibility is allowing kind of chance to operate. So I often say, by chance, I met this person. And this person happened, and I can tell you about this because it relates to quite an important body of work. I was going to France and really for another project altogether. And I did think while I was there I might actually see what was happening in terms of bee science, because I know they had really banned the use of certain chemicals and were doing some very good research on the impact of agricultural chemicals on kind of bee population and pollinators. So I went to the French embassy and I don't know why, I just thought, well, maybe they know someone. Next day, the cultural affairs officer rang me and said, actually we've just had a call from someone in France who's really doing interesting work in the area of bees and education, and we can put you in touch. So I then got in touch with this bee scientist who welcomed me into his laboratory and has become one of my closest friends in the kind of the journey of bees and education, bees and art. Yeah.
Some of the images you've got are electron microscope photographs of dead bees, and they're amazing photographs and quite profound. But again, they aren't conventional photographic images in any way, because, for example, they don't use light. And you've discussed a little bit about how they came about. Could you maybe tell us a little bit more about the process of taking an electron microscope photograph of?
Well, I made these in the laboratory of Jean-Pierre Martin, the scientist who I mentioned, and he showed me this as a process, and which is something that he wanted to show me how he saw bees as a scientist. And we were talking about how the subtleties of kind of bee biology that you can see in a scanning electron microscope. So when I put a bee into the microscope, I saw something incredibly different. So I started using it, not as a means to understand the invisible kind of hairs on the eye of a bee, but more as a way to make a portrait. So this idea of using a scientific instrument to make a portrait of a bee. And again, recognising really by chance the kind of qualities this image-making process had. And I'd been working with bee wings and delighted and engaged with their translucency and the way that light passes through a wing and has all sorts of qualities that are quite amazing. But these images don't really use light. So the process is a bee is coated, it's a lovely word, it's sputter coated with gold. So a molecule thin layer of gold is you coat a dead bee with this tiny bit of gold. It then goes into a vacuum, into the chamber of the microscope, and the gold activates an electron beam which kind of then is like a data, it's reading it. It's a little bit, it's very similar in a sense, conceptually, to how light kind of passes across something to make it visible. But when I looked at the photographs, they had this strange quality that I couldn't identify, and that the wings of bees should be translucent. So if you have a sense of light, and yet these were kind of like thick, they looked like they were covered by dust, like a thick coating of dust. And it gave me then the sense of them having been found somewhere a long time in the future, when bees no longer exist, so that they were these kind of monumental objects that had this quality of sculptures or quality of kind of portraits that were from another time. So I liked that. So I then made this work really utilising these particular qualities to speak about for the bees in a future time when the bee no longer exists. So I created an installation that was really like a museum in which these were kind of hauntings from a future.
They are incredible images, the monumental ghost electron microscope images. I had a kind of question, is there an intentional connection to religious altarpieces? Then you talked about elegiac quality of your artwork, and to me they reminded me of some sort of kind of futuristic icon image of nature.
Yes, well I made these photographs, and something about photography, because it's often has us think about something from the past or something that we've lost, has an automatic, it can be elegiac very easily. And yet my own pleasure with bees is not around their death, it's around their life. So I was challenged really to think about how I might make an artwork that really spoke both about the death or the loss of something, but also about life. So the work that's at the centre of the book, Conversātiō, which is also the title of this work, was really an idea to take both ideas and put them together. So instead of a photograph being an elegiac and sad monument to a dying or a species that we may risk losing, I wanted to put a living colony of bees at its heart. So the idea for that work really draws from two sources. One, this kind of 18th century idea of a cabinet of curiosity or a cabinet of wonder. But it's also structured to reference a medieval icon, so an altarpiece. So it has a kind of the eyes of bees on the outside, and when it's opened, what you have is a kind of an icon, a living system at its heart. So there's definitely
Of course, there's lots of Christian myths about bees and beehives.
Yes.
The series of photographs, Eidolon, is close-up images of bee wings. They are semi-abstract, and like the title suggests, they're ideal images of phantoms or spectres, kind of fleeting, ghostly but beautiful. Can I ask you about the aesthetics of beauty in your pieces? Do you come with an intentional, I would like this image to achieve this effect, or is it more it evolves through the process?
Both, I think. I think there is a... you are looking, and I don't know what that... I don't know exactly what that is that I'm looking for, but I often will find it and know. And I think it is, for me, a photograph succeeds when it shows me something in a way that I have not seen it before. But it also operates in a kind of an interior sense. So it's about, and it's one of the lovely ironies of photography that I love, is that it's dealing with the kind of the appearances of the world, and yet it's pointing to an experience of those things that we cannot see. So that is what I look for in, I guess, if it's beauty or if it's in the aesthetic qualities of an image. I want it to be something that is you come back to again and again. So it's to dwell on something over time as an image, or maybe feed your soul.
I maybe got about another 5 questions to go. Just like you know. You've already talked about the Cabinet of Wonder, and it's a piece where you said there's a living bee colony in the gallery, and it's playing with that 16th century idea of the classic cabinet of curiosities, you know, where they'd have the narwhal's spike as a unicorn horn, or geology or amphibian stuff. But I think there's 2 intentions in that piece, because the piece isn't a cabinet of curiosity, it's a living organism. Is there a kind of dynamic play between the title and actually what the piece is? Could you tell us a little bit about that, please, Anne?
So I wanted that work to be performed so that it has there's 2 ways to experience it in the gallery. One is as an experience of wonder. So what I did at the Queensland Art Gallery was really design, and I worked with scientists to create a tunnel that went through the gallery wall that was framed. There's a gilt frame at the entrance for the bees that fly through the gallery wall, and the bees fly down their entrance wall to their colony. And as they're flying, the way the work is lit is that their shadows fly on they're seen flying on the wall. So to encounter it as an artwork is to see and to wonder about what might be in this cabinet. So it's a really stimulation, it's to stimulate the imagination and curiosity. So both of those things are there. You don't have to actually know that there's a colony of bees inside, but you have to arrive at that as a possibility. And then, are they in prison? I love the questions people ask me. Are they in prison? Where do they go? And so the opening of the cabinet was performed 4 times a day, and I loved the relationship I built with the team of, they're the visitor services team, but they're normally the people who you see guarding artworks and to ensure they don't touch them. So these were engaged as the people who would actually create an experience for people in the gallery. So it would take about 5 or 10 minutes, the doors would open. And behind the doors, which have the eyes of bees, these kind of bees staring out at the audience. Inside is it's a very 18th century lush red velvet insulation panel. That keeps them warm as a function. And then there is revealed, a little bit like an icon, this living colony of bees, which is the idea was the living artwork. And you know, my conclusion at the end of all my time working with bees was that there's nothing more extraordinary than the actual colony of bees themselves. So to give that as an experience to the viewer, not a photograph, but Yeah. Conceptually, it was conceived of as what I thought was a very thick photograph that was alive inside. So
we've talked about this a little bit before, and I was thinking about the way that people like the Victorians thought about science and how they tried to categorise everything, label everything, and define everything. Do you think that there's an intersection between art and science that contains the possibility of exploring ideas or concepts difficult for purely classical ideas of science to grasp? So exploring that area where science kind of runs out of tools to understand things.
Yes, I had the privilege of working in the laboratory of an eminent bee scientist in Brisbane, whose work on bee vision and navigation has led to the development of pilotless aircraft. So he's a bioengineer and a robotics engineer, but his study of how bees see and navigate and the complexity of their kind of vision systems and how they navigate through the world has produced extraordinary scientific understandings that we translate into things that we use. And I've often broached kind of questions with him because, what he's learnt really and what science tells us, good science tells us, continues to tell us how little we really know about things. So art and science together can feed each other. I'm in awe of what he knows and how he has gone about finding things out. And I've had I've just enjoyed the pleasure of working alongside him in his laboratory to design a little piece of an artwork. But I think I'm absolutely confident that art's domain is a very different one, and it really does, it dwells in this domain where the questions we ask are very human questions. They're really about the kind of speculative storytelling that really has us kind of question what it means to be human, that science can't answer. So when I ask this question, around the consciousness, the complex consciousness, and how marvellous it is of a colony of 70,000 bees, no one has an answer to it. And I love that. So we muse, we dream, we speculate. And that's, I think, probably more important for us to do more of than this kind of reliance on scientific or rational knowledge as the kind of primary mode of our understanding the nature of the world around us.
Do you think that's changing in science? I'm thinking about kind of how quantum scientific ideas ask almost for like religious belief in the almost unknowable with like four-dimensional stuff. So like modern science asks us to think in different ways from like classical Greek science.
I don't think we need science to know that. But no, it's not. We don't need. No, I shouldn't say that. I think certain kinds of science. So I think there are ways to know that are combinations of kind of observation and practice and experience. And I think certainly the revelation and the revolution around accepting indigenous knowledge systems as actually being highly scientific, highly observational based over time, so that
Yeah. I mean, like if you read about Aboriginal culture in Australia and the way that culture perceives the world in such a different way from our Western one, you go, there was something very deep and profound that we've lost that they have.
Yeah. So it's multifaceted observational skills that somehow, Yeah.
We've talked a little bit about hive mind, multiple creatures and consciousness, and I know that you're working on a project about forests. Is there an intersection between your work with bees and that sort and forests? And if so, could you tell us just a little bit about that?
Well, it's one step. It's only one step away from bees. I mean, you can walk in the bush, or I walk through my garden, and the bees will tell me where to look. But I think it's really this same question around the complexity of a living system. This notion of a living interconnected whole, and just like a colony of bees, I'm amused and entertained by the fact that we anthropomorphise with trees without even realising it. So we see a tree or a forest as being comprising of forest giants, of single, solitary, magnificent beings, not too dissimilar to human beings. You know, there is a way to see, and I took some of my learning about bees and just thought, well, actually, it's possibly the same, where we have a kind of an interconnected web of beings that are not singular entities. And there's a lot of science being done, revolutionary science, some by people who probably 10 years ago were ridiculed, that have provided evidence that this is actually true, that the forest is called the worldwide wood, you know, that there are wonderful and marvellous interconnected networks of food transfer, of communication amongst, that the shape of the canopy is kind of a shared space that is actually developed through communication. So I find that marvellous and wonderful. And again, it's a little bit like bees. There are thousands of years of storytelling and narratives that kind of try and explore the forest as a kind of space that has an interior metaphor informing it. So we're in the forest of the night, or we're in the...
I have just two more questions. Can I ask you just a really practical question for all the people who are watching this? What things can we do as individuals to help our bees and the wider ecosystem? Just daily things that we...
Well, if we are planting gardens, we can plant things that bees love. We can not use chemicals around bees, so be very, very careful with actually what we do in the gardens and the spaces that we plant. And I think just be aware that anything that we do has actually got a footprint way beyond ourselves. And I think, well, bees have shown me that, but I think that's something that they can signal with.
And my final question is, are there any books that you think you would like to share with us that people should read that would give them further insights into bees or your work or some of the ideas behind your work?
Well, generally, I read a lot about the thing that I'm particularly interested in. So I've read so much about bees, and photographing Antarctica. I had an Antarctic library, so I've become fascinated with the particular ways that cultural habits and practices that inform how we see this particular thing, whether it be bees or the forest. Certainly in terms of forests, there's some wonderful books around at the moment. There's a book called Overstory. There's, which I've enjoyed, Suzuki writing about trees. I'm just reading Suzanne Simard's book, which is really the story of her development as a scientist and her understandings of the interconnected nature of the forest. So I think I'll read anything related to... I love poetry, and I often look for kind of poetry or how we construct metaphor and how we then distill that through narratives. So in terms of bees, I love Emily Dickinson. So, you know, I have, you know, I love her poetry. I love her kind of, her just fragmentary observations that you just carry with you. In terms of the forest, I'm reading quite a lot of poetry, Dante's Inferno. In a forest dark, it begins, ... So I'm actually titling my next exhibition here at Alison Bartley's, In a Forest Dark, ... So it is really, so you enter a space, or the space of the forest, as a metaphorical space that allows a kind of journey of the imagination.
So Professor Anne Noble, thank you so much for the time you spent with us and the fabulous interview. We're really grateful.
My pleasure.